So today's presentation will be given by Professor Griet Vankeerberghen, an historian of the Western and Eastern Han dynasties, an associate professor of the Department of History and Classical Studies of McGill University in Montreal. She graduated from the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium and from Princeton University. She is the author of the Huainanzi and Liuan's Claim to Moral Authority, and editor with Michael Nylan of Chang'an 26 BCE in Augustan Age in China. She has published articles on several Western Han texts and their social, political, and material contexts, including the Huainanzi, the Shiji, the Four Lost Classics, and Shangshu dazhuan. She is currently engaged in a research project on Western Han Chang'an, supported by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. With Hans Beck, she is co-director of the Global Antiquities Research Network. Today, she will be speaking on an act of imperial generosity, remaking the social order in the 1st century BCE China. Please join me in welcoming her.
So good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Miranda, for the kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for having come to this lecture. I always, at the end of the semester, it's always a little bit harder to get people out, so I'm very happy to see, you have come in such great numbers. So I'm going to read my talk, and from time to time I'll pause to point something out at the PowerPoint. So much past work on early China, especially in the West, has been on individual texts. And this textual approach continues strong, especially as our textual repertoire becomes ever richer. And of course, there is nothing wrong with thinking about texts and their affiliations with other texts. At the same time, our materials also lend themselves to a different set of questions, that of the cultural and social meaning to specific groups of people at particular moments in time of these texts, but also of words, of objects, of places, of institutions, of titles, etc. We now have a wealth of sources to start answering such questions. As is well known, traditional sources are heavily biased towards the upper layers of society, but we now have many additional sources, including excavated documents and evidence of material culture, that help us mitigate that bias. We also have much better tools available, ranging from electronic databases over the biographical dictionaries of Michael Nylan and Rêve de Crespigny, to the increasingly detailed work of contemporary Chinese and Japanese historians and archaeologists. Furthermore, theoretical developments in the humanities generally furnish us with a great many sophisticated questions about the social and geographical distribution of power and about the impact of global developments on local lives. Questions that should help us get beyond the emperor by emperor account of events that has characterized much of historical scholarship to date. It is in this spirit, appreciative of all the work that has already been done, but also daunted by the many as yet unexplored questions and possibilities, that I offer you today's presentation. It deals with the changing meaning of the Western Han institution of liehou, or which I translate here as nobles, particularly in the early to mid 1st century BCE. So we're in the Western Han dynasty. But I'll take an extended tour through the 2nd century BC, kind of the beginning of the Western Han dynasty. My presentation zooms in on a small and seemingly insignificant event that took place during Xuandi's reign. In 65 BCE, 136 families, descendants of men recognized as meritorious subjects during the reign of Liupang. Liupang was the Han founder. So these 136 families were promised tax exemptions in order to maintain in perpetuity sacrifices to their illustrious ancestors. So I'll just read it. Exempt from taxes the 136 families of descendants who, like Zhopo, the noble of Jiang, and I'll talk about this noble more, were recognized by Emperor Gao. Emperor Gao is the same as Liu Bang, as meritorious subjects. So order them to offer sacrifices generation after generation without interruption. If they have no direct descendants, exempt their next of kin. A related entry in the annals, but dated 3 years later, kind of says that these descendants were also entitled to receive 20 Jin of Gold each. And 20 Jin of Gold is about the equivalent of 10 pounds, 5 kilos of gold. So this series, so it's kind of 2 entries in the annals section of Hanshu. So this series of imperial gestures towards Emperor Gao's meritorious subjects is quite exceptional. We have for both Western and Eastern Han many records of cases where either tax exemptions or valuable goods were provided to specific population groups. Donations of valuable goods were common to celebrate auspicious events. For example, the appointment of an heir apparent or of a new empress, etc. Tax exemptions, in contrast, were often offered to the inhabitants of specific regions only. For example, after their resources had been depleted by war, by natural disasters, or by imperial travel. We also have cases of grants or of titles or goods to specific individuals, and sometimes to several individuals at a time. In our case, however, the target group of the imperial largesse is both large and unusually specific. So we have exactly 136 descendants who are targeted. So what is the meaning of this imperial gesture? Why did it happen at all? And why did it happen at this critical junction in Xuandi's reign? The Marshal of State, Huo Guang, who was the power broker in the empire after the death of Wudi, had died in 68 BCE. And then in 66 BCE, a rebellion led by close relatives of Huo Guang had been unmasked. So we're kind of in the period right after that event. The 65 to 62 BCE instance, case we're talking about is noteworthy for a further reason. So besides the 2 short entries in the annals section, the ones that I just showed you, it is also well documented in another section of Hanshu. And Hanshu, just to be clear, it's one of the 2 major dynastic histories for covering the Western Han period. And it consists of several sections. It starts with an annals section, which gives you imperial events on a year-by-year, month-by-month basis. And then it ends with biographies, and in between those are other books. Amongst them are tables. So really kind of very technologically very interesting to think about. So there are tables in the middle. And so my point here is that kind of these, the nobles who were given those tax exemptions receive entries in the tables. So the table has 123 entries of nobles who, of people who received this tax exemption. And kind of this is just an example of one of those, and this is the example of Zhopo, the person who was also mentioned in the annals entry. So in the 4th year of the Yuan Kang reign period, Zhopo's great-grandson, Zhou Guanghan, residing in Kuaili and of the 8th rank, received by imperial instruction a tax exemption for his family. Another example concerns the descendant of a noble who is very well known for different reasons. This is Li Zhucang, who was ennobled in 193 BCE in Tai. so it's a very similar phrasing, but you might be familiar with this noble because this is the one whose wife is the famous, now the famous mummy of Ma Wangtui. You probably have heard of that famous tomb at Ma Wangtui. So it's about her husband that this record is, or about kind of a descendant of this family. You will immediately note some interesting discrepancies. First, the number of tax exemptions recorded in Hanshu in the table is 13 less than the target number of 136 set out in the annals entry for 65 BCE. Second, the noble of Tai, who was ennobled in 193 BCE, was ennobled 2 years after Liu Pang's death, whereas the annals target only people who were ennobled during Gaozu's reign. Third, the exemptions in the table are all noted for 62 BCE, whereas in the annals they were supposedly already granted in 65 BCE. Fourth, in the few cases where a grant of gold is recorded in the Hanshu table, the amount is 10 jin, rather than the 20 jin that is mentioned in the annals entry. Some of these discrepancies can be explained by the inevitable messiness involved in the implementation of government directives. For example, by the time it took to find the descendants or to verify the claims of those who had themselves come forward to claim the tax exemption. Others may also be due to scribal errors that occurred as the Hanshu tables were being compiled or were being transmitted. Nonetheless, both sources provide us with excellent data, not only to study the difference between imperial gesture and the reality of its implementation, but also to do a prosopographical study with considerable depth in time of Gaozu's meritorious subjects and their descendants. In its idealized form, the social hierarchy of the Western Han and also Eastern Han looks somewhat like this. So there is a tripartite ruling group at the top, consisting of the emperor, Huangdi, at the top, then the regional kings, the second layer, and then by the nobles of Lieho, with the 20 in front. The emperor, the regional kings, and the nobles are all associated with a domain over which they had at least nominal rulership. And that really sets them apart as members of the ruling class. The nobles are in a very interesting position because they form part of the ruling group together with the regional kings and the emperor, but they also occupy the highest step in a 20-step system of ranks, which we call jue. So you see the 20 ranks, or 21 if we count also that 0.5 at the bottom. And then beneath this system of ranks are various categories of unranked people, including convicts and slaves. Generally speaking, positions within this social hierarchy are hereditary via a system of primogeniture. So this system was a fixture of the Han dynasty. And such a schematic representation of the social hierarchy always misses what these social institutions really meant to those who partook in the system. That the social and cultural meaning of this seemingly stable social scheme changed dramatically over the course of the Western Han dynasty, particularly in regards to the nobles, is at the heart of my argument today. So much of this social scheme was implemented in 201 BCE, when the civil war in which Liu Pang was involved had ended in the death of his main rival, Xiangyu. At that time, Liu Pang took the title of emperor and awarded allied warlords with kingdoms, and he gave his loyal comrades, which he now called meritorious subjects, noble titles and domains. 54 or 44% of the nobles who were given the tax exemption a century later received their titles and domains in 201 BCE. So just after the victory, just after Liu Bang became emperor, and this includes Zhou Po. So Zhou Po was given the rank of noble and given his half of the tally, signifying that the fief was to remain in the family for generation after generation without end. He was granted the income from 8,180 households in Jiang, and his title was noble of Jiang. So you may note the place where the noble domain is part of the title of the person here. This map, which is drawn up by Ma Menglung in a recent book, presents the location of noble domains in 197 BCE. So all the dots, are noble domains. So you can very clearly see that these noble domains are not everywhere in the empire. We don't have them here, which is the capital region. We also don't have them in what is now kind of Sichuan area. So they're really mostly in the eastern part of the empire. And kind of the nobility, the domain of the noble of Zhou Po, the noble of Jiang, is the one here with the blue square around it. So that one was relative. It was not only large; it was also very close closer to the capital than most other domains. The men who were made nobles in 201 BCE, or in the years that followed, were almost all military veterans. They had served Liu Bang in the revolts against the Qin regime, in the subsequent civil war against Xiangyu, or after Liu Bang had become emperor, helped him to suppress the many rebellions that broke out against his regime. Whereas a few of these men were descendants of the great aristocratic houses of the Warring States period, the vast majority were, like Liu Bang himself, social upstarts. Many, moreover, derived from the area around Bei, where Liu Bang also was coming from. So Peixian, which is present-day Suzhou, right here. So they kind of made that move from this area to the capital area. Zhou Po is a case in point. So he was a man from Pei, from very low social background. According to his biography in Shiji, before he joined Liu Bang in the uprising against Qin, he made a living as an artisan, producing the bamboo trays that were used to raise silkworms. And he supplemented his income as an entertainer by playing the flute at funerals. But the events of his time turned him into a military man. Zhou Po was at Liu Bang's side during nearly every military confrontation. That his merit was of a military nature is made clear by a tally of his military achievements, which is provided in Shiji, but undoubtedly is also, based on a different record, some kind of official document existing out there. So his tally: as follower of Emperor Gao, he captured 1 prime minister of state, 2 chancellors, 3 generals, 3 officials of the rank of 2,000 shi. He defeated 2 armies, captured 3 cities, and brought under control 5 commanderies and 79 counties. He also captured 1 chancellor and 1 commanding general. Zhou Po's palmarès brings home the point that the Western Han system of ranks, inherited from Warring States Qin, has military origins, and that it was developed as a way to encourage soldiers to fight, and to fight bravely. In fact, as the following table makes clear, Zhou Po's title as noble of Jiang was by no means the first time that Liu Bang had given Zhou Po a title or an income domain. And so here, Shi Yi means he already received the domain, and here he's made noble of Wei Wu. But the interesting thing is that Wei Wu, if I try to translate mighty warrior, you can find different translations. But the point is, it's not the name of a place. So it's really not as real of a domain as the other, as the later domains, and this goes for all these wartime titles. So my point is that these titles that Liu Pang was giving out during the war years were really more promissory notes than anything else. So they guaranteed alliances with the other warlords, and as well as the continued loyalty of his soldiers, and with the idea that one day when peace came, they could be cashed in for something real. Liu Pang's power after his victory over Xiangyu was indeed very much restrained by the titles that he had awarded during the war period, and by the many alliances he had concluded with warlords who would otherwise have turned against him. Slowly his regime was transitioning from a regime of war to one of peace. Liu Pang's major challenge was how to deal with the men who had helped him to victory. His tactics were a classic case of divide and rule. He dealt very harshly with those warlords who served as his allies during the fighting and had their own independent armies. Even though they were the ones who received the higher titles as regional kings, they were the ones who got eliminated one after the other in his first years as emperor. On the other hand, he heavily promoted his own soldiers, especially those people who came with him from his home area. And their entire career was built upon serving them. So it seems as if Liu Pang fully intended to make this latter group of men, as he himself established the capital in the area within the passes, into a group that besides military power also would have political, social, and economic power. So he is in effect trying to make a capital-based ruling elite out of a group of commoners, artisans, and petty officials from his home area. Liu Pang's project ran into substantial difficulties at the very early stages of the demilitarization process. After he had become emperor, but before he started investing men such as Zhou Po with their new titles and domains, Liu Pang had serious difficulties getting the local authorities to acknowledge the wartime titles and benefits of the veterans who settled in their areas. The following passage clearly indicates the high level of frustration the newly minted emperor experienced and expressed in the face of the passive-aggressive tactics of local authorities. So he says, I have already issued numerous edicts ordering the local authorities to give the veterans priority in the allotment of land and dwellings, and to urgently grant them whatever they have appropriately requested from the authorities. Some of those with rank are rulers over people in their own right, and are to be treated by the emperor himself with honor. Now the local authorities, they keep them waiting forever without deciding their cases. This is really beyond words. In the past, when commoners under Qin received the rank of grandee of the realm, which is rank 7 on the scheme I showed you before, magistrates and clerks were to treat them as equals. Now, I do not treat the ranks lightly at all. How come local authorities on their own accord feel entitled to treat them that way? So one can only imagine the disdain these local power holders felt when war veterans, earlier their social inferiors, came to claim land, titles, and honors. A former maker of trays for silkworms, turned soldier, suddenly catapulted to the top as a ruler of men, was to be treated by the local officials as a social equal or even a superior, on orders of an emperor who himself lacked a pedigree. Liu Pang had to do something to make the wartime titles and benefits meaningful, and he seems to have intended expressly to turn his former loyal soldiers into members of the highest political class. Case 16 of the Zhuoyan Shu, which is part of the legal documents found in Zhangjiasha, indicates that these newly ranked men achieved political office at slightly lower levels as well. Case 16, which also dates to 201 BCE, deals with a noble within the passes, and that's rank 19. So the Lieho are rank 20, nobles within the passes are rank 19. So who was the noble's name was Xin. He was registered in Luoyang, but appointed as a county magistrate in Xinchi County in Huaiyang Commandery. And he owed his appointment and rank to a battle during the Civil War, dating to 205 BCE. So while magistrate, Xin had, in a fit of anger, threatened a clerk with a sword. And when the clerk said, "I'm going to denounce you to the authorities," Xin, the magistrate, had ordered his underlings to assassinate the clerk. An alert commandery governor, who was the kind of the boss of the county magistrate, ferreted out the case, and it ended with the death by execution of the magistrate Xin and of all the underlings who were involved in the murder. Barbieri, Law, and Yates, who have just come out with a translation of all the Zhangjiasha manuscripts, write the following about this case. The behavior of magistrate Xin, who had conspired and ordered the murder of his own scribe, demonstrates that he was a ruthless, violent man who used methods born of the strife of the Civil War years. He was surrounded by a group of personal retainers who were just as ruthless, more loyal to Xin than to the laws of the empire. Liu Pang clearly did not need this type of county magistrate to get his newly founded Han dynasty off to the kind of start that would encourage those who still had doubts about its legitimacy to submit to its authority. I would agree with Yates and Barbieri Law that Xin used violent methods and that these are related to his earlier career as a soldier. I am not sure, however, about Liu Pang's not needing this type of county magistrate. I think that Liu Pang could not afford and did not want to alienate the man who had fought along his side, and that such localized violence was collateral damage that he was willing to take. In other words, it is the commandery governor, kind of the one who tried the case, who might have been the subversive figure, perhaps frustrating Liu Pang in a manner similar to the local authorities in the passage that we looked at earlier. Once Liu Pang consolidated his position, he seems to have become very successful, not only in awarding his followers with noble domain and titles, but also in investing them with political office. Research conducted by Li Kaiyuan has shown that during Emperor Gao's own reign period, close to 100% of all the high ministers and kingdom chancellors here, as well as 88% of all the commandery governors, were in their positions because of the military merit that they had accrued during the Civil War when they served Liu Pang. Zhou Po too accumulated high office, including for a brief period during Wendi's reign, the position of chancellor, the highest in the realm. Which you can see here. Li Kaiyuan's table clearly shows that whatever Liu Pang intended, the men that he had appointed as nobles for their military merit steadily lost their political clout in subsequent reigns. So just look at the numbers going down in each of the categories, right? So this is so they're losing their access to political office. One reason behind this drop might be the substandard performance of the nobles, who, operating on a sense of entitlement, kind of were poorly equipped to handle the demands of their high administrative jobs. They also came into competition with more ambitious candidates with knowledge and skills better suited to the changing needs of the administration. The office of Chancellor, the highest of all, presents a clear-cut example. Until 124 BCE, this office was always occupied by a noble. In later years, of course, no longer the war veterans themselves, but one of their descendants. Sima Qian provides a list of their names and severely criticizes the chancellors for their lackluster performance on the job. So they have title, but he says none of them proved capable of making any brilliant contributions to the government or doing anything to distinguish their names in the eye of their contemporaries. In 124 BCE, Wudi, who was then emperor, took the unprecedented step of appointing as the next chancellor a man without such noble descent. This was Kung Sun Hong, the Kungyang scholar, who in his youth had been a swineherd. Both Shiji and Hanshu very clearly marked this appointment as a turning point, as a moment of change. And when I thought about this in the past, I thought of it in the context of the ascent of a classical scholar to high political office. But it is probably even more important as a marker of the fall from power of the group of men and their descendants who were promoted by Liu Bang. What is interesting is that from this time onwards, every non-noble appointed as chancellor would immediately be rewarded with a noble title and a domain. In other words, the link between nobility and high political office that Liu Bang had created still held, but it had almost cynically been reversed. This reversal indeed may be what Shiji and Hanshu are flagging to us. So Liu Bang seems to have been right that carrying a noble title without entitlement to political office was meaningless. The following graph oops, sorry, I'm going back instead of. I have it upside down, that's why. The following graph shows for our sample of 123 descendants who were given the tax exemption in 62 BCE when their ancestors were in possession of their noble titles and domains. And we see, us with the chart about the political office, here too we see a steady decline. Until by 87 BCE, at the end of the chart, not a single noble descended from the generation of the Han founder remained. The year 112 BCE, the one marked by a blue arrow, was particularly hard hit. During that year, close to 100 nobles lost their titles and domain, and they were all accused of having offered gold of the wrong color for the imperial sacrifices. 83% of those nobles were nobles appointed during Gaozu's reign. Ma Menglong speculates that this group was hit disproportionately because they possessed the largest and most populous domains in a time of deficit that was caused by Wudi's wars of expansion. So reappropriating those domains in particular was lucrative for the treasury. A descendant of Zhoupo, the one we've been tracing before, lost the nobility of Zhang in precisely 112 BCE. The tax exemption entries in the Hanshu table provide us with an interesting picture of the descendants of Liu Bang's nobles as a group. The entries provide us with information about the descendants' rank, their name and residence, as well as their relation to the lineage founder. So this one we've read before. So in the 4th year of the Yuankang reign period, Zhoupo's great-grandson, Zhou Guanghan, residing in Kuaili and of the 8th rank, received by imperial instruction a tax exemption for his family. And so we learn about his rank of the 8th rank, Gongsheng in Chinese. We learn his name, so Zhou Guanghan. The names are quite interesting to look at. We also learned that he was a resident of Kuaili, or Kuai village. In terms of rank, the following picture emerges. So of our group of 123 descendants, there are 2 unranked persons. And then we see clear peaks of kind of many individuals at ranks 1, 5, and 8. And then very significantly, there is only 1 person who has attained rank 9. In 2 cases, there is an occupant of a rank that's not a regular rank, but one that I marked here as M, which is one of the military ranks that Wudi instituted during his reign. There is general agreement among scholars that by the 1st century BCE, there was a clear upper ceiling in this system of ranks that I showed you before. So here, that it was kind of impossible to rise above rank 8. And so the emperor would grant, kind of at several occasions, he would grant everyone in the empire a step, but then this was the ceiling. You really couldn't go behind this ceiling. And everything below here was called commoners' ranks. Everything above from 9 upwards was called lineages, kind of officials' ranks. So what we see is that kind of amongst our descendants, there was only one who was above that ceiling. So they really had gone down, and they really had all become commoners. The tax exemption that was decreed in 65 BCE and implemented in 62 BCE did not restore a nobility to these people, but it certainly brought them economic benefits. But it is very difficult to assess kind of what the economic situation of these descendants was. The noble domains granted by Liu Bang a century earlier had tended to be very large, and certainly losing those domains meant an immense loss of income. On the other hand, it's very possible that these nobles had been able to accumulate a lot of private land in the process, and it's quite possible, I think, that they were amongst the great landholders in the kind of in the empire, but we don't know that. We don't have any evidence for that. The tax exemption, while not restoring the descendants to high social rank, was to be carried over from generation to generation in the manner of a social rank, according to the principles of primogeniture. And I'm going to skip this because we're a little bit running behind. So one other interesting piece of information that can be garnered from the table that I compiled of these 123 nobles concerns the residence of these descendants. So of our group of 123 descendants, the vast majority, or 71% of them, lived in the area around the capital of Chang'an. And the others, they lived there are, for every of the red, the places circled in red, there are 1, 2, or maximum 3 of the nobles who resided there. And what's interesting, so the ones who live outside of the capital area, very often they live very close to the domain that was granted to their ancestors. So it's a very interesting situation. Those who lived in the capital area, 40 of them, so 40 of the 88 lived within the walls of Chang'an city, and we think so. This is the Weiyang Palace, the Changle Palace, and this is the area where we think those nobles may have had their residences. These numbers, but of course we don't know whether the descendants still lived within that quarter or whether they had been forced to move to different areas in the city. These numbers shed some interesting light on 2 interrelated questions. The first question is that of where the nobles tended to live, at the capital or in their domains. In the previous century, Wudi had ordered the nobles to leave the capital for their domains, but then judging on where their descendants live, a majority must have returned to the capital or never left the capital in the first place. So, I mean, just to illustrate this by the case of Zhoupo, so he had been forced by Wudi to return to his domain in Zhang that I showed you earlier for a little bit, but then he had returned to the capital, and he was buried in Changling, which is the here, which is the Imperial mausoleum of Gaozu. And it's very likely you might have seen these soldiers from Yangjiawan. This very possibly comes from the tomb of Zhoupo, but some people think it's the tomb of his son. But he was buried in very rich circumstances in the Chang'an area, and then his descendant, the one who in 62 BCE, he lived in Kuaili, as we saw, which is about 50 kilometers west of Chang'an, and so not quite in the center, but still within the larger metropolitan area. The second question that I'm interested in about this residence is that of the relatively low mobility of the population at the time. So with some exceptions, it seems as if the commoner descendants of these nobles stayed more or less put in the area where their ancestors had lived and worked. There is only one exception, as you see. I said before that in Sichuan there were no descendants. Here we have one case who lives in the southwest. At the outset of this paper, I raised the question of why the tax exemption was granted at this particular junction of Xuandi's reign during the Yuan Kang reign period, after the death of Huo Guang and the demise of his family. Whereas I do not have a definitive answer to that question, I would like to offer some suggestions. My first thought was that the measure was meant to come to terms with the damage that was done to the institutions during Wudi's reign. And whereas the tax exemption certainly was a restorative measure, I don't think that theory holds at all, because in 72 BCE, Wudi was granted a lot of extra posthumous titles, so he was really honored, and they clearly were not inclined to blame him for anything. But then I had my aha moment when reading through the biography of Pingji. Pingji played a key role in the early life of the emperor. So the future emperor was still a baby when the witchcraft affair broke out in 91 BCE. A multi-year disturbance targeting the family of his mother, the Wei family. So Xuandi's grandfather was the heir apparent at the start of the affair. He got murdered. Xuandi's parents also got murdered, and Xuandi, as a little baby, ended up in prison. And Pingji was the person who really saved, who really cared for the baby and made sure that he survived the ordeal. And so when that very short-lived emperor about whom you might have heard from Miranda, the later Hai Hun Ho, lost his position as emperor, Pingji made the following suggestion. So I have listened to the common people and taken care to find out what they are saying. And if I may speak boldly, there does not seem to be anyone among the nobles and other titled members of the imperial family who enjoys any degree of reputation with the populace. There is, however, Wudi's great-great-grandson Pingji, who is, that's the future Xuandi, etc. So I see a kind of a parallel between, on the one hand, Xuandi, who through birth was destined for rulership, so he's a direct descendant of Wudi, but through circumstances ended up among commoners. And then on the one hand, the descendants of the nobles we've been talking about. So they too are of elevated birth, but through time and circumstances have lost their noble ranks and become commoners. And it's definitely no coincidence that this tax exemption measure comes at a point in time when Pingji, 65, 62 BCE, when he becomes ushered, so the second highest, when he gets the second highest position in the empire. Pingji's promotion and the tax exemption for the descendants came just after the fall of the Huo family, after members of the Huo family had sought to take over the imperial throne for themselves. The promotion of the descendants of Liu Bang's nobles through the tax exemption measure also must have sent a strong signal that reaffirmed the power of the Liu family and helped the Han imperial house build a coherent memory narrative about itself. So through the measure, Liu Bang's associates were to be celebrated as founding heroes, as divine figures entitled to permanent state-sponsored sacrifice. They were no longer the superfluous men, ill-equipped for political office that they had seemed during Wudi's reign. Conscious political conscious politics of memory were now replacing the expansionism and the opportunism of Wudi's reign. And I will stop here. I had a little bit more, but I'll stop here because I think we've had enough of this. So thank you for your attention.
I use the mic when you ask the question.
Yeah, I assume that this is the first instance of the merit subjects. And they certainly have a history in later centuries. And I'm thinking particularly of the Ming and Zhuanzhang. And they, of course, they and their descendants, as you point out, pose a very specific problem over the generations. What do you do with this hereditary privilege? And of course, Zhuanzhang had a rather short answer to it. He cut it off. So I'm entranced by the way that you have followed this deep into the dynasty and looked at the question of the transition from the hereditary privilege to the quote unquote noble aspect of what eventually becomes the scholar officials. So this is the first time that we do have that particular status. Is that correct?
I think so. I don't think I've seen it before Western Han, but I will verify to make sure. But yeah, I mean, thinking about the Ming Dynasty, it would be very interesting to do this same type of study and to see, and maybe it has been done, but kind of to see what happens to all of the descendants. But what I would like, and what I meant to point out at the end, is kind of what I think we're seeing, especially kind of with this kind of measure, taken during Xuandi's reign, is really the start of something new in Chinese history, where we get a kind of a coherent aristocracy. And this is a new thing, and it kind of, I was thinking in terms of Tackett's book, which documents the end of this type of aristocracy towards the end of the Tang and the Song. So I wasn't tracing it as far as the Ming Dynasty. But I think we have a lot more material, and there's, if you think about it, there is a lot more that I could have brought into the presentation about how this kind of new nobility, these new elite classes kind of gather themselves. Thinking of your work, Miranda, when you write about the steel inscriptions, at that point, this elite has already a much more coherent form than it has at this point in the Western Han Dynasty. But it's incipient, it's starting, so it's pretty interesting to trace and follow.
So am I loud enough, or maybe I should take this? So, Griet, thank you so much for this. I was actually thinking that this is a wonderful corrective to what I would consider to be the excesses in the field, especially sort of these institutional approaches that we often see where, people look at the Han as the beginning of this wonderful Chinese meritocracy, or they see institutions as kind of evolving in particular directions. And I think your sort of the last part of your discussion really highlights the sort of level, the importance of political exigency and power struggle, and sort of the formation of various sort of institutions rather than any decision to become modern or efficient. I don't know if you want to speak more to that.
Well, I mean, I don't know, maybe just alert people to a great new book written by Tamara Jin on this period. And she really focuses in on Wudi's reign as a rather exceptional regime, as one where, things were looking, in economic terms, at least relatively modern. He was expanding. He didn't really care very much about traditions, which we saw very well in how he treated the nobles. But then in the 1st century BCE, they start to go, they go back to classical models, but it doesn't happen overnight, and it changes constantly. I think that's what I want to emphasize. There is no one mold that fits the whole history. So this, they might always have had these nobles, but what it meant to be a noble kind of changed dramatically over time.
Okay, the historical book we read seemed that the emperor, when Liu Bang started he win the battle, the war, and he got so many noble. There's so many people help him, like Han Xin, Xiao He, Zhang Liang.
Yes.
And they all, I think Han Xin was a he became a so-called a big. He got a big chunk of land, and not only they are tax exempt, but I think they are able to collect taxes from the place that they have given. So, and then later, Liu Bang, he through his empress, killed Han Xin. This was a very historically in the opera, in the theaters, you can always see this. And it's quite interesting that once you obtain the country, then you are afraid that people is going to take your place. So that's I think the Chinese imperial. It's repeating. It's not only Han, but in other period, it's the same thing, except those. Nomads, the Mongols or the Qing, the Manchurian, their emperor. I think they all learn this pattern of eliminating, who has more power, and they are afraid that they will be losing to the person.
Yeah, Han Xin, he was made a Zhuhou Wang, so he was one of those Zhuhou Wang. But by 195 BCE, all the Zhuhou Wang were of the imperial family, so he really eliminated them one by one, as you say, because he was so afraid. And then Zhang Liang and Xiaohe. Zhang Liang is amongst the group of, his descendants got the tax exemption. Xiaohe. His descendants had gotten a new noble title because he was so important to Liu Bang. So he had, yes. Yes. Because he was, but he had to prove his loyalty to Liu Bang all the time, and there were a few times where it was a little bit iffy, but he managed to get away with it, and he survived the ordeal. Yeah, thinking of modern parallels, I always had to think of the modern generation in 20th century China. I think there are some very interesting parallels to draw with this particular episode as well, and kind of in terms of how elites are dealt with, etc. But I'm not going to go there right now. Other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming out.